Welcome back. Here we are. Paleocrat Diaries on the Meaning of Catholic. And once again, I'll be your host, Jake Fowler. We're today changing it up a little bit, taking another break from the councils. We did this a few weeks ago when I talked about the manifesto of the new traditionalism. Got me in a little hot water with the rad trads, but that's okay. I can take it. Today, part of my contribution to the channel for Pope Benedict Appreciation Month, I thought it would be interesting to go over the Regensburg Address, which actually isn't the title. I'll get to that in a moment, but that's how it's known. Benedict delivered this address September 12th, 2006 at Regensburg University, where he was a professor right before he was named Bishop of Munich Freising. So, there's a lot to unpack. I've got a whole outline ready to go. In good German fashion, I've got a beer. Let me quiet the music down as I normally do. Okay. Here we are. Oh, I already did my introduction. I should just add the title of his talk is actually Faith, Reason, and the University, Memories and Reflections. Now, we all know it as the Regensburg Address, and it became quite popular for reasons which will become apparent momentarily. I'm just going to begin. I'm not going to read it. I thought maybe should I read it? I don't know. It's kind of long. It's not that long, but it would take away from our ability maybe to really dive in. So if I'm just reading it word for word, that's not suitable. So what I'll do is offer a summary and then commentary and analysis, and focusing on what Benedict means rather than what I have to say about it personally. Although, as with anything else, my opinion and my biases will come through a little bit. It's inevitable. Nonetheless, here we go. So the Pope begins by examining, the whole thing is an examination of the relationship between faith and reason and how that relationship bears on academia, particularly in the university. He uses, right, in the initial point, few points, he's got some fond memories to relate about how he's glad to be back and he hasn't stood at this podium in so long, and it's all very nice. But then he really gets to the heart of the matter. And he starts it by bringing up this dialogue that he had recently been reading. There was a translation, new and updated, if you will. He was going over it, and he said it caused him to stop and think about the Christian ideas of the relationship between faith and reason. And the dialogue that he was referring to was one between a Christian and a Muslim. And he uses it to highlight significant differences, and from there to jump off into his reflection of how faith and reason ought to interact with one another on university campuses. The Christian in question here in this dialogue is none other than the Byzantine Emperor, Manuel II Palaeologus. And he's in dialogue with a man who is known as an educated Persian. His name isn't given. They come to a point where they're talking about what they call the three rules of life, that is to say the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Quran. So in other words, they're discussing Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And they're having what seems to be a pleasant discussion, but at a certain point, the emperor brings up that, in his view, Muhammad brought nothing new to the table except violence, except religious compulsion. This is the part that the media latched onto when Benedict gave this address in 2006. You can kind of remember back then, wasn't that long ago really, the United States was engaged in wars on two fronts, one in Iraq, one in Afghanistan. The global war on terror was a big thing happening. I guess still to some extent, not really. The 9/11 terrorist attacks, the attack on the USS Cole, all these kind of things were still very fresh in people's minds. And so when Benedict XVI makes this point, right, even though he says we don't appreciate the emperor's brusqueness, right, something that we can't get behind, nonetheless, this is what the emperor said. Well, there was a big media firestorm, right? Even though he was simply reporting a conversation that happened some 700 years prior. This would have been, the original conversation would have been somewhere at the end of the 1300s, perhaps 1390s, something like that. And, I have down in my notes that this is sad, but not really surprising. The media, they latch on to what they think will sell rather than the heart of the matter. So we should then not do that. We should turn to the heart of the matter. And as far as I can tell, Benedict wasn't trying to make a negative assertion about the correlation between Islam and violence. I think there is one. I think we need to be honest about that. But that wasn't his main goal in the Regensburg address. He goes on illustrating that, again, using this dialogue as a jumping off point, the emperor says things like, well, religion is primarily a matter of the soul, not of the body. Therefore, physical compulsion is inadequate for someone to make an act of faith. You see, love can't be forced, and the love of God even less so. If it's forced by God himself or someone else, then it isn't truly love. It ceases to be. If it's forced by God, if God forces us to love him, then we're sort of like holy robots or something. We're just doing as we're programmed to do. And if another human being forces us into some religion or other, then it's not truly a gift of ourself. It's not truly a belief that this is true or that this is the God that I want to love. It's simply out of fear. And fear and love are not the same. Compulsion, taken in this sense, is anti-logos. The emperor goes on saying, to convert a soul, one needs not weapons, threats, nor force of any kind, but simply, this is my words here, to convert a soul, one needs simply the cross and its majestic power. Now, for dedicated Muslims, there is no inherent rationality in God. He transcends all human categories. Theirs is a voluntarist conception of the Lord. He can even act contrary to reason if he wanted to. He could violate his own word. He could command that we commit idolatry. And all of these things would be permissible to him because ultimately it's God's will that is primary rather than the good, the true, and the beautiful. This is in direct opposition to the Christian understanding. And this is where Benedict wants to shift from the conversation between the emperor and the educated Persian into how are faith and reason viewed not only in Christianity, but in the West, and specifically in academia. Logos is the key concept to understanding Christianity's version, if you will, of the relationship of faith and reason. Benedict wants to ask, is it simply a cultural motif of Greek learning, or is it intrinsic to the nature of Christianity that logos, that is to say, reason or word, is the fundamental paradigm? Again, the Christian-Muslim contrast was simply a jumping-off point. After this, the Holy Father goes into what he views as a profound harmony between Hellenistic culture and Christianity. And he cites, the Apostle John John the evangelist, John the theologian, the first verse of his gospel, first chapter, in the beginning was the Word. John is using the Greek word logos. So inspired by the Holy Spirit, St. John asserts that biblical faith is faith in the logos. The Word is God, he says. To act with reason, or sin logos, is not only compatible with biblical faith, but is in fact intrinsic to it. This was Manuel II's point to the Persian, and this is Benedict's point to us today, that to act contrary to reason, to act in a way contrary to logos, contrary to rationality, is, to a certain extent, in fact to a very large extent, to act contrary to the nature of God. So this cooperation, if you will, between Greek culture and Christianity is, according to Benedict, a matter of providence. He sees it not only like it's some chance encounter, or, oh, look at these two things happen to work well together, but referencing Acts chapter 16, verses 6 through 10, specifically verse 9, if memory serves, Benedict brings up St. Paul's vision. He has a dream. He wants to go into Asia to bring the gospel to those folks, but in his dream, he sees a man from Macedonia, and the Macedonian wants help. He says, "Come over here and help us." Paul wakes and realizes this is the Holy Spirit, that God is leading him not to Asia, but to southeastern Europe. Macedonia, therefore, is sort of a gateway to Europe, if you will, and therefore to a fuller and fuller encounter with Greek ideas. And it's no accident that Christianity took firm root here, right? It seems obvious to Benedict and to me that God wanted this. He wanted a closer union of faith and reason, and he was going to achieve that through Paul and through the missionary efforts into Europe. It's this synthesis, biblical faith and Greek culture, coupled later with the Roman heritage, that eventually became what we recognize as Europe, and Europe became what we would eventually call the West. So we can say, once more with Benedict, that God brought the faith to a direct encounter with reason. Now, I think there's a lesson here, so this is me talking. I think that in this encounter that we read about in Acts 16, where Paul has the vision, he goes into Macedonia, and from there into Greece, and so on and so on. I think there's a lesson, and I believe the lesson is this: believing in Christ, faith, is ontologically prior to doing theology. Theology understood as a rational investigation of the faith, right? What's the Latin? Fides clarens intellectum, right? I believe that was Augustine and Anselm and other scholastics. This is faith seeking understanding. It's faith first, then the understanding comes. So I believe that I might understand. Faith is not judged by reason, but precisely the other way around. And this encounter between Greek paideia, or education, culture, ideals, philosophy, etc., this encounter between that and between the faith of the Israelites, Hebrew religion, had already been underway. It was a dynamic of conflict, really, in the time before Christ, especially in the period of the Babylonian exile, when Greek culture really clashed with Hebrew religion. Still, despite all of that, Benedict points out that there's a sort of rapprochement occurring wherein a mutual enrichment seems to take place between biblical faith and Greek learning. Okay? The Holy Father moves on. The providential encounter that we've just spoken about and the subsequent mutual enrichment is only made possible through the concept of analogy. Analogy meaning we can say true things about God even though he utterly transcends all of our understanding. Okay? Well, not all of our understanding. Obviously, or we wouldn't be able to say anything true about him. Hence the concept of analogy. Lateran 4 in 1215, which we will get to, by the way, in the other series. Might take a while, but we're getting there. Lateran 4 makes it clear that Catholics are to always remember that the unlikeness between us and God is always infinitely greater than any likeness. Despite that, we can say true things about God, about our relationship to him. Okay? Benedict wants to point out in his address that keeping God at a distance doesn't make him more divine. In fact, it sort of makes him less divine. A God that can't handle contact with his creation? That's odd. That's not the Christian understanding, anyways. Besides, the evidence we have, the incarnation for one, says otherwise. It's the self-emptying of the incarnation that reveals to us the true love, true divine love of the King of Kings for his creatures. And this love is Logos. So if God is Logos and God is love, then it follows that love is inherently rational. Love is self-communicative. It's self-diffusive. It wants to overflow its goodness into those around it. And the same thing goes for the truth, for Logos, reason, word. In the final analysis, these are the same. Love wants to be shared. The truth wants to be shared. And this love, this Logos, in the person of Christ, gives himself to us. He shares of himself such that we can now receive the truth into our very being. I can receive the love of God by the incarnation. By the incarnation, Christ makes himself receivable by me, by you, a physical being. Of course, I'm speaking of the Eucharist. The Word has joined himself to our flesh. How is the Eucharist made possible? Well, it's the sacrifice of the cross and the sacrifice of the Mass. Now, thinking back before to the contrast between the Christian and the Muslim, sacrifice of oneself is precisely the opposite of religious compulsion. It's a religious invitation to partake of the love that lays down its own life. An invitation to embrace love rather than commit an act of intellectual violence, forcing the faith on another. From his pierced heart on the cross, the Logos calls into our heart. Cor ad cor loquitur. In the second section, or what's really the third section, of his Regensburg address, Benedict XVI then wants to discuss, after having laid out how fitting it is that God would bring biblical faith and Greek culture into such a beautiful harmony, he points out that there are some, in fact, many, who want to de-Hellenize Christianity. That is to say, they want to sever the bonds between God and reason, faith and reason. They don't like it. And they give various reasons. This intimate bond, as I mentioned, was forged in the first several centuries of the Christian era. And now encompasses a large swath of time, honestly. This now that I'm referring to begins about 500 years ago in the Reformation. Nonetheless, now some assert that this is an undue accretion, that was simply one mode of expressing Christianity, and that mode was rooted in a particular time and place. They say nowadays we don't need all of that. We should shed it and search once more for the pristine gospel message, free of all that Greek learning, all that Greek philosophy. We don't need that. Benedict criticizes this approach, and he shows how in three general movements, he's painting with fairly broad strokes, and he admits that. Nonetheless, in three general movements, how the push for the de-Hellenization of Christianity has taken shape. First, as I mentioned, it begins with the so-called reformers in the 16th century. They rejected reason's compatibility with faith. They wanted a faith divorced from reason, hence Luther's insistence on the irrationality of things divine. Luther, I'm paraphrasing here, and it's a bit of a caricature, I'll admit. He says, in a nutshell, if you understand it, it's not God. Well, okay, fair enough. That's true to a certain extent. But what he's really wanting to get to the heart of is undercutting reason insofar as reason helps us grasp the faith. Faith for Luther and reason for Luther are mutually exclusive. Now, a few hundred years later, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, 18th century philosopher, he really drove the wedge between faith and reason when he asserted that, in Benedict's words, we must set our thinking aside in order to have faith. You see, for Kant, faith was a matter of morality only. As long as you did what you thought you were supposed to do, right? You obey your duties as a moral person. That's really the essence of religion. And the Holy Father observes, Kant has thereby denied faith access to reality as a whole. That's the first stage of the de-Hellenization of Christianity as the Holy Father saw it. The second stage that Benedict identifies is that of liberal Protestantism, which is best exemplified by Adolf von Harnack. Harnack was a biblical scholar around the turn of the 1900s. And Harnack says that it's kind of the same thing the reformers said, the so-called Protestant reformers, that we need to get back to a pristine gospel message. We have to uncover, you've heard this phrase, the Jesus of history, and separate him out from the Christ of faith. Now, that is an entirely false dichotomy, but this is how Harnack thought, and he was very influential to many other people. For Harnack, you see, the gospel wasn't simply the message of Christ, but it was the culmination of man's growing religious sense. Now, that's true in one way, the same way that a moment ago Luther's statement was true in a certain way. But I'm pretty confident that von Harnack did not mean it in an orthodox sense. He meant, as far as I can tell, that Christ comes to the world to shed religion of its worship and instead bring something like a humanitarian moral message. Why don't we just all get along? He basically turns Christ into Captain Kangaroo. His goal, Harnack's goal, was to align Christianity with so-called modern reason. This is Benedict's point here. He says Harnack wanted to re-legitimize theology by bringing it into line with reason understood in the modern sense. He wants to liberate it from the crushing grip of philosophy and theology. Well, how do you bring theology back into line with modern reason and liberate it from theology? Well, there's really only one way to do it, and Harnack wants to do it through a historical, critical study of the Scriptures. Such an investigation would lead naturally to a purely moralistic religion. If you hold aside all theological considerations and you simply look at the Bible for its moral message, its historical message, and you divorce it from faith, what you're going to end up with a handbook of do's and don'ts that really just amounts to be a nice person. We know that that's not the message of the Scriptures, but this is how Harnack viewed things. And so he wanted, once more, to separate out Greek learning and biblical religion. Underlying this belief is that reason is just another word for empiricism. Benedict picks up on this, and he sees two problems with this. The first is that this certainty, that certainty can only be obtained through empirical sciences, through mathematics, through the hard sciences. And the result, as the Holy Father sees it, is that the humanities attempt to conform themselves to this new standard, thereby distorting their true nature. And theology would presumably be included in that. The second result that Benedict sees from this underlying equation of reason and empiricism is that theology and philosophy therefore appear to be unscientific, or rather pre-scientific. Benedict says this should be questioned. I say it should even be opposed. When reason is reduced simply to empiricism, the basis of religion can only be subjective. Benedict goes on. This brings up once more the question of religious truth, the question of logos as a perduring concept. If man's sentiments are what dictate his religious belief, in other words, if conscience is the sole arbiter of truth, well, this is what we call modernism. And I don't mean modernism to say this is something I don't care for. I mean, this is actually what that is. Religious indifference ensues. We've prioritized the subjective, the religious experience, the religious feeling, the encounter, if you will, over the objective truth of the matter. And when we do that, what's true to you and what's true to me, being based solely on our subjective experience, those things are probably not going to line up. And if everyone accepts the basic principle, then it's sort of like, how could I ever say that you're wrong? How could we ever determine what is and isn't a religious truth? Well, community at this point breaks down. Benedict says there's nothing that can truly bind us together. If truth is out the window, logos is gone, then the communion that can only be wrought by logos, by love, by the incarnation itself, it's been destroyed from within. The third stage of the de-Hellenization of Christianity, and one that Benedict sees as currently ongoing, at least in 2006, I would say, yeah, we're still going with this. This is the attempt to cast off Greek ideals because they ought not bind us to a culture that isn't our own. They were from long ago, a foreign land. We should seek a new enculturation, so the story goes, by going back to this pristine New Testament gospel message. Same thing that the Reformers said, same thing that Adolf von Harnack said. Benedict, again, sees this as a problem, and he points out that this is completely false. We hinted at it before. Greco-Latin culture had already been in deep contact with the faith of Israel even prior to the advent of the Messiah. Despite the fact that the two were often in conflict and opposed to one another, the truth is both left their mark on the other. So it's inadequate and it's historically false just to think that there's such a thing as a pristine New Testament gospel message untainted by Greek culture. It simply didn't happen that way. Besides, the New Testament was written in Greek for inhabitants of the Roman Empire. Right? This is just a further point. There is literally no way to conceive of the gospel divorced from that environment. It wouldn't have any of its essential features. Benedict concludes his reflections at the University of Regensburg by offering some suggestions on how to move forward. He says first and foremost that this is not a call. He's not issuing, he's not coming out with a new plan to turn back the clock and go live in the past. He says we don't need to reject the good elements in order to reject the bad. So the good elements, I think he's referring to things that have legitimately grown out of Western culture and are compatible with Christianity. Not everything was. Those things were critically sifted through. Some were jettisoned and some were retained. That's the process of enculturation. However, those things that were jettisoned, we can cut that out and still retain what's good. One of the things we can retain, for instance, from the Enlightenment is a scientific ethic. That's a worthy thing because in its purity, and Benedict points this out, in its purity, the scientific ethic is obedient to the truth. It seeks it through the natural world. There's nothing wrong with that. And I would like to add, these are my words here, that it's only in a Christian cultural context that such a thing could develop in the first place. In other words, the belief that faith and reason are not opposed to one another is what led to scientific inquiry. Everyone knows that it was the Catholic Church and her priests who developed the scientific method. Everyone knows the church is not opposed to science when science is done properly. Benedict also wants to shed this distorted view of reason as empiricism. And he wants to welcome theology back to the university, to the secular, public university. He says this is the only path forward. Faith and reason would then come together in a new way, and another round of mutual enrichment would ensue. Theology would have to be itself, though. It would not be able to try to live up to the phony standards that modern empiricism has laid out. So the humanities, instead of trying to twist themselves into being scientific in the empiricism sense, would simply be themselves once more. And this seems to be a reasonable suggestion. We wouldn't want biology to conform itself to any sort of spiritual standards that transcend its purpose. So we shouldn't try to cram theology and philosophy into strict empiricism that really undercut their purposes. And Benedict once more points out that science itself is not opposed to this. Its very structure points to deeper questions, questions that it cannot answer, questions that are at the center of every culture and the center of every man's heart. To refuse to engage them, or to refuse to listen when others engage them, Benedict says, would be a great tragedy and one we must avoid at all costs. The Holy Father closes his Regensburg address with another quote from Emperor Manuel II Paleologos. He says, quote, "Not to act reasonably, not to act with logos, is contrary to the nature of God." It is to this dialogue that Benedict is inviting other cultures. And it is this very task to which we must set ourselves. Me, you, Flanders, Bannister, the whole crew, all of us. It is to this task that we must all set ourselves if we are to recover the lost harmony between reason and faith. All right. There you have it. The Regensburg Address. Oh, cheers. I hope you enjoyed that. A little different. It's not history exactly, not theology exactly, sort of a reflection on culture. It's an appreciation for the thought of our past Holy Father, Benedict XVI. My contribution to Benedict Appreciation Month. Don't forget to like, hit the thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, patronize the Meaning of Catholic crew, join the Wolfpack chat on Telegram. You know that place never sleeps. Until next time, when we'll be back again talking about the ecumenical councils, I hope that all of you are following along and learning maybe something once in a while. Until next time, though, never give up, keep on smiling, and memento mori. God bless you, and good night.